Welcome back, everyone. Today we're here to talk about the new Aurelia card, Aurelia the Law Above. First and foremost, when I read the name for this card, the first thing that came to mind was...
I never broke the law! I am the law!
Anyway, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the card. It's a 5 mana for a 4/4, Flying Vigilance Haste, awesome set of keywords. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. And whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia does 3 damage to each of your opponents and you gain 3 life. So, upon my initial read of this card, I wasn't all that excited for it. It seemed a little generic in my opinion, but as I actually started sitting down to figure out how I was going to build this deck, I started to get more and more excited. One of the things that I noticed is that, similar to the original Aurelia, is that there's a pretty wide open field of things that you can do with this commander because it just cares about creatures. So if there's a particular theme or subset of creatures you want to build around that aren't super well supported somewhere else, this is going to be a pretty good commander to do that. Because at the end of the day, if you run a lot of creatures, you're probably going to have a pretty good time with this card. So some other things that I noted on this card. First, the big one is it says whenever a player, which means any player, attacks, which is really cool. That's really cool wording. Potentially, you could be drawing up to 4 cards every turn cycle, assuming no extra combats. But also, if you or someone else has extra combats, then you can trigger this thing even more. And finally, the one thing that I haven't really seen people talking about is that if you put lifelink on this thing and get that 5 creature trigger, you're going to gain 12 life plus 4 more from the combat damage. That is an absurd amount of life gain, and that's what's personally got me most excited about this card. It is surprising that there is not really like a great lifelink commander in Boros. I think Brian Stoutarm is the only one with lifelink off the top of my head, and that's kind of a weird deck in general. But yeah, putting lifelink on this thing has got me really excited, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So anyway, we'll talk about some of the specific build things that we can do in a minute, but first I just wanted to start with some fun synergy cards that I saw that aren't specific to one strategy or another and can go in a lot of variations of the deck. So here's some fun synergies. First up, we have anything with Battalion is going to be really good because obviously these care about the same thing that Aurelia cares about. I've never been the biggest fan of Legion Loyalist, but I actually think it's going to be pretty good in this deck, especially if you're doing the token thing. And the other 2 are just nice to have. Next, we have to talk about both Odrics. Both are going to be insane for this commander. Odric Lunarch Marshal will give you the ability to spread Flying Vigilance and Haste to your team, let alone any other keywords that you might have. And I've done this with the original Aurelia. It's really strong. The second, or rather the first, the original Odric, Master Tactician, also cares about the same sort of thing that your commander cares about, and importantly, gives you evasion or even some pseudo removal, depending on how you choose to line up blocks. It's a really cool card and one that I wish I've played more than I have. But mono white go wide has always been kind of a tough sell for me. But this is a really good deck for it, so I'm excited that this card now has a really good home. Also, as a side note, the card draw for this deck is insane, and Odric as a commander may actually be possible now. And then, of course, we don't talk about the third Odric, because that one's trash. Moving on from that, we see some extra combats. Extra combats, always really good in a combat-based deck. Even more so for our commander. We're going to be able to trigger those abilities more times. And in general, if you have a well-set-up board, like let's assume you're getting that 5-creature trigger on Aurelia, and you're having an extra combat, at least one player is probably dying, if not more. But Morag and Aurelia are great because they're both creatures with extra combats. Both do a lot of nice things. Waves of Aggression and Aggravated Assault are really good if you're running Sword of Feast and Famine. Really good for the combo aspect of it. And then finally, we've got some things that are a little more budget-friendly with World of War, and Resurgence is probably the most bang for your buck in terms of extra combats, because you get the extra combat plus the keywords for Strike and Vigilance. Really, really cool for like 25 cents or however much it cost. And one final note on extra combats. Generally for a deck like this, you're going to want about 3 of them. Tends to be about the right number, although I did note that the card draw for this deck is insanely good, so you could probably get away with 2 if you wanted to. And then finally, initially I had this plan about how I was going to do this whole Soul Sisters type deck with Aurelia, and I kind of scrapped that, but in that process I did notice that both Ranger of Eos cards are really good with this commander because 1, you can search for a 1-drop, but 2, it helps you put more bodies on the battlefield. So just a nice little value piece can go in any of these decks. Great for finding your Weathered Wayfarer, your Sarah's Ascendants, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about some of the builds that I've identified that you can do with this commander. I may be missing some, there may be more, but this will be a great starting place if you're trying to figure out what you want to do with the deck. So here are the main builds that I've identified with this commander. First up is tokens, and we'll talk about those pretty extensively. Second is go wide aggro. Probably don't need to touch on it that much, but just generically good creatures that you can attack with. 3 is Angel Tribal. I'm not going to go into that in this video just because I've played a million games of Angel Tribal on this channel, so be sure to check out my other videos for that. 4 is Life Gain, which we'll talk about a little bit, and that's the one that's got me kind of excited. 5 is keyword combos, and if you guys have been following, you guys know that for the past year or two, I've been really hot on playing keyword-centric decks. And then finally is Mass Goad, and that seems to be the one that like most content creators are talking about. So we'll start with the Mass Goad deck. I will say that this one is the one that has me the least excited. I don't care for Goad as a mechanic. I think it's too strong, and it feels terrible. Undoubtedly, if you play any of these cards, they will win you the game, assuming that the board is set up. If there's not a lot of creatures on board, then these will feel pretty terrible and just sit in your hand until there's hopefully a time where they make sense. But yeah, Goad is just not a mechanic that I care for. I don't like losing agency of my creatures. But if we're doing that, here's some more things that also goad your opponents. I was surprised about how much support there is for this style of deck. I wasn't even initially going to include this in the video, but there's a lot more cards available for this style of deck than I was really anticipating. So for some of you, this may be a thing that you want to do, and here's some creatures that'll help you do that. And finally, I know some of you out there are fans of Varchild, and it's like a pretty tricky deck to play. The Goad version of this deck is a really good home for Varchild, which is fun. And if you're doing that, you should probably run Crescendo of War because that card is hilarious and brings a smile to my face. Moving on from Goad, we have Keyword Combo. So like I said, I've been playing a lot of keyword decks recently. I find them a ton of fun. The keyword combo is very straightforward. It's basically get Odric into play, spread your keywords, at least Flying Vigilance Haste as long as your commander is in, and then the secondary plan is to get Achroma Vision of Ixidor in play, and if you do that, you'll probably win the game. And then of course there's a couple ways to tutor for legendary creatures. War of the Last Alliance, being a new one, allows you to tutor for 2 legendary creatures, which means that you can run this like in a pretty tight package in your deck, right? That's 3 card slots, and Odric by itself is going to be good anyway. Achroma might be a little slow at the top end, but these aren't exactly dead cards. So yeah, you could easily run a 3-card package with this as a nice little finisher for the deck. And then of course there are other things that grant keywords to our creatures. Here's some great options. And I would definitely include some of these regardless of whether I'm doing the keyword combo or not. Next up, we have tokens. I think tokens will make up the overwhelming majority of builds that you see, at least initially, with the new Aurelia, because she does care a lot about having bodies in play. So first up, we want to run a lot of creatures that make tokens. Here's some great ones. I've used these a lot. If you've played Winota at all, a lot of these may look very familiar, and they're all fantastic in their own ways. Next up, we have a cute little one that you don't see all that often, but is actually a surprisingly powerful card. That's Knight Captain of Eos. It makes 2 soldiers when it comes into play, but importantly, you can sacrifice a soldier to Fog. This gives you a surprising amount of board control, particularly if you're in a Fog meta. If you're in a combo meta, it's not going to help you as much. But, you know, if you're trying to not die to like Crater Hoofs and stuff like that, this is a nice little option that fits in with what we're going to be doing. And beyond that, it's just a fun card. I've had a lot of fun with this card in the past. So moving on from that, we see some enchantments that help us generate tokens. In particular, Felidar Retreat is going to be insane in this deck. And I mean, it's really good in a lot of decks anyway. But for this deck, it both makes the tokens, which we need bodies, and 2, makes them bigger and puts vigilance on them. All fantastic stuff. Super good card. Next up, we see a few more ways to make tokens. These ones in particular are all from this year. So if you've been struggling to keep up on new cards like I have, these are some nice ones that you may want to take a look at. And finally, I know some of you older school Commander players in the room are wanting to run Assemble the Legion, and I'm here to tell you, if you're not proliferating this thing, it is too slow. It is very difficult to find the meta and have everything set up the right way to actually get this thing to work the way you want it to. Now, if you're running a little bit of Proliferate in your deck, then sure, why not? But in general, I have not had great results with Assemble the Legion, and that's even going back a few years when the format was slower. That said, don't let me stop you from having a good time if you want to jam this in your deck. And then we see some instants that allow us to create tokens. And to be honest with you, I wish White would get more of this instant speed token production, because it's actually really strong when you can do all the stuff at the end step and dodge all the board wipes. And just as a cute little thing, so if you're playing tokens or really any version of this deck, Kabira Takedown is going to be good because you want a lot of creatures in play. Kabira Takedown is going to be a really good removal spell. I run it in a lot of decks, and because I run it in every deck, Sajiri Shelter is also fantastic. So next up, we have token support. The key with tokens is that you can't just spit out a bunch of 1/1s and hope to win the game with them. You need to support them, and there's a number of ways to do that. So here we see the doublers, we see Mondrak, and we see Ozir Tak. It just occurred to me that I forgot Anointed Procession, but definitely include Anointed Procession if you're doing the token thing. And notably, Mondrak does double like Smothering Tithe tokens and other types of tokens that you can be creating, so that is notable. Next, we talked about size a little bit. The Ajanis are really good for this sort of go-wide style deck. So I'd actually like to talk about each of them a little bit. So Ajani Steadfast, we have the -2, which pumps up our team. Love it. The +1 is also an additional way to get lifelink on our commander, and as I talked about, if you put lifelink on Aurelia, you're going to be gaining absurd amounts of life. Next, Ajani Strength of the Pride. This one you would run particularly if you're doing the life gain thing and really focused in on that because, like I said, you're going to be gaining a ton of life with Aurelia. I mean, if you do 2 combats with lifelink and that 5 creature trigger, you should easily be 15 above your starting life total. So then you can use that 0 ability, and that 0 ability is super nasty. Next up, we have the original Ajani Goldmane. I've been running this more and more. Maybe it's because, I don't know if it's just the style of decks that I've been playing or what, but I've been having a lot of success with the original Ajani Goldmane. Making your stuff a little bit bigger and giving it vigilance is really, really effective right now. And if I had to guess why, I think it's because you don't see Eldrazi and like massive creatures running around anymore. So like, the difference between like a 2/3 and a 3/4 is pretty sizable because creatures in general are smaller, right? Because that same difference doesn't matter if there's a 10/10 Eldrazi across the board. But yeah, I've really been enjoying Ajani Goldmane. It's positioned really well for these sort of go-wide combat decks, things that care about vigilance. And finally, because we're talking about Ajani's, Ajani Vengeance is simply my favorite planeswalker. It doesn't do anything specific for the deck, but if we're running all of these, we might as well just throw it in there because it's a super cool card. Of note, it says target permanent doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. That can be helpful against a Cradles, a Coffers, or a Mazavith, just that you do need them to tap it first. And then as we talked about a little bit, you are going to want some Iroas effects for your tokens. When you go to combat, you don't want to be losing your tokens in combat because then you're losing value as you're attacking. And even though it seems like losing a 1/1 might not be that big of a deal, it has a surprising impact later in the game, especially as you start pumping them up with the Ajanis like we talked about and some other things we'll talk about here in a minute. So Iroas, just fantastic for these go-wide type of decks. Dolmen Gate, also great. Loyal Unicorn is budget Iroas and gives vigilance, which I didn't even know until last night when I read it again. But Loyal Unicorn, highly underrated. And then finally, Reconnaissance is a weird old card that is pseudo-vigilance and allows you to keep your stuff alive by removing it from combat. But yeah, personally, I would probably run 2 to 3 of these type of effects. Next, we see some finishers. These both grant a ton of size. Cathar's Crusade, +1/+1 counters. Gold Knight Commander, +1/+1 until end of turn. Both make your team massive if you're spitting out tokens. Plain and simple, these things will give you the damage you need to end the game. So we've already talked about the fact that our tokens do need size, so obviously we want to talk about anthems. In general, I'm not the biggest fan of the Glorious Anthem style anthems. In my opinion, they just don't do enough. Now, Elesh Norn, on the other hand, is the single greatest anthem in this game. So that one's super powerful and somewhat backbreaking depending on how strong you go in your meta. But Ben Elish Marshall is a cool little one that is an anthem on a body, which is nice. On one of the previous slides, we did see Thraben Watcher, which gives some of our creatures +1/+1, in addition to Vigilance, which is nice. Force of Virtue and Dictate of Heliod are both interesting in that you can flash them in, and you might be able to surprise them and like have your stuff survive a Toxic Deluge or something weird like that. But in general, I'd probably run 1 to 2 of these. I wouldn't get carried away right here. Though, like we talked about earlier, giving your stuff +1/+1 is more impactful than it's ever been. So if you wanted to run a third, it's not the end of the world. And then I figured I would talk about it here. Marshall's Anthem, while generally used as a reanimation spell, is also an anthem. So for this deck, that makes it really, really good because we want anthems and we do want reanimation. So I would definitely run Marshall's Anthem in probably every build of this deck. And then, of course, because we're talking about reanimation, Ascend from Avernus is the gold standard for mass reanimation in white. So I would probably just run that anyway. But yeah, I was surprised about like how good Marshall's Anthem will be for this deck. And then if you're someone that's into like blood artist type of effects, there are a few of those that are available for this particular commander. I've been using Rage Thrower a little bit in Ashling, and in Ashling, it is a win condition. It does kill people. Brazen Cannonade is a newer one that does the same sort of thing on way less mana and is not a super fragile creature, which is cool. And then Throw to the God Pharaoh just cares about having lots of tapped creatures, so you may not want to run so much Vigilance if you're running Throw to the God Pharaoh, but I figured I would include it anyway. And then because we're talking about tokens, there are some board wipes that do help you a lot if you're running tokens. Hour of Reckoning is great. Dusk and Fell the Mighty care about creature size, and Martial Coup can wipe the board and make you some tokens. So you want to look at a couple of these. Depends on how many board wipes you need in your meta. I'm still like a 4-ish board wipes kind of guy. I know many people run less than that now. Next, with tokens, we do need to give them evasion. So I have a General Ferris Rokiric deck, and that commander spits out 4/4s like crazy, and you'd be surprised how easily stopped those 4/4s are without evasion. And so as I was playing the deck, I realized that like, oh yeah, you really do need several sources of evasion to make sure you get the damage through when you need to. That's actually the first deck. I've been playing Boros for a long time, and it's the first deck where I've run Master Warcraft, which allows you to choose attacking and blocking creatures, and it's surprisingly effective. But anyway, these decks being very similar, the same principles will apply, so Master Warcraft is going to be really good here. Bond of Discipline. I've been got with this thing a number of times. Tap all creatures your opponents control. Creatures you control gain lifelink. As we talked about, that's going to be a massive amount of life gain. And even more so with the Aurelia triggers and everything else. Akroma's Memorial, if you're running a lot of creatures and you play Akroma's Memorial, someone at the table dies, if not everyone. It's still incredibly effective. So absurdly good for creature decks. And then Winds of Abandon, technically a removal spell, but I included it here because it is a great way to get your stuff through. And then finally, as like a super budget-friendly option that is also surprisingly effective, Cosmotronic Wave does 1 damage to each creature your opponents control, and then they can't block. So you can blow up all their mana dorks, and then they can't block, and then pile in a bunch of damage. So it's a nice little play for 4 mana. Moving on from that, we get to the thing that I'm excited about. That's the life gain. Like I've talked about a bunch of times, put lifelink on Aurelia and get that 5 creature trigger, and you are going to gain a lot of life. So first, we see some really good life gain payoffs. Probably the best one for this deck is Nykthos Paragon, because your team will just get massive, and if you are planning to go deep into the life gain rabbit hole, Aetherflux Reservoir is probably never going to be surpassed as a life gain payoff. It's just so absurdly strong. Also worth noting, Heliod Suncrown has the ability to grant lifelink, which is also important for the reasons that we've talked about, so that is a nice one as well. And then here we see some really good ways to get lifelink on our commander. Luxodon Warhammer's really well positioned right now. I've been talking about it for probably 2 or 3 years. Again, because creatures have gotten smaller and there's no Eldrazi running around, 3-0 in Trample actually means something now. You get more damage through, you're gaining more life, and particularly like things have gotten more deadly, so you lose life quicker. So being able to gain life back is a pretty big deal also. Shadow Spear, fantastic. Resurrection Orb is a newer one. Has the ability to get your thing back. True Conviction is going to be fantastic in this deck. You're running creatures. Giving them double strike and lifelink is absurd. Be prepared to gain a ton of life and probably kill multiple players at the table. Bruce Tarl is always a nice option. And then finally, Witch's Clinic is a land that grants lifelink, and I do like that because you can grab it with Weathered Wayfarer, and we talked about Ranger of Eos earlier. So now you're talking about like having multiple ways to pull this land out of the deck, so nice easy thing to go get. And then we see some like life gain value cards. So in particular, these give us the ability to make more creatures by gaining life, which then just plays completely into our plan of having a lot of creatures in play, attacking, getting all the triggers, etc. Before we move on from this, I was planning on looking at a whole Soul Sisters build for this deck, and I found that it's probably not necessary to do that because it's literally just slap lifelink on Aurelia and you gain a ton of life. But that's certainly a thing that you could do and would be a very interesting direction to take the deck. Next up, we have card draw. I was absolutely blown away by the quality and amount of card draw that's available to this deck. A lot of stuff has been printed pretty recently that White actually has card draw now, and I can't believe I'm saying that. So first up, we have some non-creature stuff. Idol of Oblivion, great because we're making tokens. Tome of Legends, always good for an attacking commander. Staff of the Storyteller is a newer one, cares about tokens, allows us to draw some cards. And Horn of the Mark. not exactly card draw, but we're running a lot of creatures, and we can sort of filter to a creature we like. Maybe we're trying to set up that keyword combo, or do something else kind of wacky. Next, we see some spell-based card draw. Showdown of the Skalds, I absolutely love in combat decks. Ignite the Future, I absolutely love. Wheels, I am liking less and less in today's day and age. Giving your opponent 7 cards can be pretty nasty, but they're still nice to have around. Wheel of Misfortune is the affordable one. Wheel of Fortune is the not affordable one. So you can make your own decision about if you want to run the wheels or not, but I do like both of the impulse cards a lot. And then we get to the creatures. I was absolutely blown away by how many creatures give you the ability to draw cards with this deck that loosely care about the same things that we're doing. So I'm not going to go through them all because there's a lot of things on this page. I will point out the Gaffer is a newer one if you haven't seen that one. Sophina is Chief Jim Hopper if you haven't seen that one. Rumor Gatherer looks insane. And the rest of these all look really, really good for this deck. Here's a new one that was spoiled recently. Wojek Investigator. At the beginning of your upkeep, investigate once for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. I love it. I really like the design of this card. As far as game balance goes, it's not super OP. It's not like Rhystic Study levels of card draw. You do have to pay mana for it, so I really like how they design this, and it's an angel, so I'll probably jam it in my angel deck. Next up, we have some mana production. These are some interesting choices that I saw beyond your typical mana rocks, normal stuff that you include in most decks. Ashnod's Altar, because we're talking about tokens. Maybe it's not the most efficient thing ever because you do have to give up some bodies, but if you're really just needing to get like 4 or 6 extra mana in a turn, you can sacrifice a couple 1/1s and maybe get all that big stuff out of your hand and potentially set up a game-winning play. Next is Oketra's Monument. Makes your white spells cheaper whenever you cast any creature spell. Make a 1/1, so we're spitting out bodies, and it has Vigilance. I run Oketra's Monument in like basically every white deck I play. It's so unbelievably good. And finally, a card that I've been trying to use in various places for a while, but haven't had the most luck. Battle Hymn, I think is actually going to be really good for this deck if you're playing tokens. Even just having like the 5 creatures in play to try to get that 5 creature trigger, that little bit of burst mana, you can do a lot with that and potentially set up game-winning plays, let alone if you have 8 or more tokens in play. And then, of course, getting ramp on a body is going to be a pretty good idea for this deck too, just because we do care about the number of creatures in play. I probably wouldn't go wild here. Is this the deck where I finally get to run Boreas Charger? Maybe, maybe not sure. But definitely Knight of the White Orchid, Loyal Hound, going to be solid. Solemn Simulacrum, maybe. It's never bad. And then finally, we're going to talk about some equipment. It's me, so I would never run a Boros deck without at least some amount of equipment in it. Not that you need to go wild, but if we're playing tokens, Skull Clamp is the most insane piece of card draw imaginable. If you're running tokens, run Skull Clamp. Even if you're not running tokens, just run Skull Clamp. Creatures die for many, many reasons in Commander. Mask of Memory, I run in just about every single deck, especially ones that care about attacking. I've tried building decks without it, and I have a bad time when I do. Then we see some ramp equipment. Bitterhorn Nissa's Animist makes a body when it comes in, which again, we care about that, so it seems really good for this deck. Sword of the Animist, all of my decks, same thing of Mask of Memory. I've tried playing decks without it, I have a real bad time. Sword of Hearth and Home is really powerful, does a lot of great things, is at home in most decks, and Sword of Feast and Famine is very expensive, but insanely powerful, and is usually some amount of like game winning. Because of that, I don't run Feast and Famine in every single deck anymore, just the ones that I need to be a little bit stronger. But I do run Hearth and Home in just about every deck. And then finally, we'll want some ways to tutor for those equipments, particularly if we're doing the token thing in Skull Clamp. Generally about 3, maybe 4 equipment tutors, depending on how wild you're wanting to go. I could even see going down to 2 if you have a lot of the card draw. Notably, Steel Shaper's Gift was reprinted recently, and it's actually very affordable right now, which is fantastic. But also, Kellen the Fayblooded is a recent one. The spell portion is search for an equipment, put it in your hand. The creature portion is double strike. Other creatures you control get +1/+0 for each aura and equipment attached to it. So that's an anthem for our tokens if we're doing the token thing just by throwing an equipment or 2 on Kellen. So that seems like a fantastic option for this deck. You're covering multiple avenues with that. You're both tutoring and getting an anthem and just having a nice creature with double strike. Put a Hearth and Home on there and you'll ramp like crazy. A lot of things to like about Kellen. So yeah, those are some of the best cards that I've identified for Aurelia, the Law Above. And what I didn't mention is that you can mix and match between these strategies. You don't have to be completely committed to one. Like I said, the keyword combo you can run with 3 cards, and I might try that. And then also maybe throw in like 2 or 3 of the life gain synergy cards. although I guess you do need to make sure you have enough lifelink for that. And then of course mixing and matching with as many token producers as you feel like you might need. But anyway, I really like the design of this card because it is wide open, because you can do a lot of things with it. So I'll turn it to you guys. What build of Aurelia do you guys plan to make? Let me know in the comments below. And finally, because I have to try this one time,
I didn't break the law. I am the law.
I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel or vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below.